Now that we've seen how to test function components, let's take a look at how to test live components. Unlike function components, live components are going to have their own state and events, so it's going to be a little bit different to test them. If you go to our router, you'll see that we have a settings live. Now, if you open up your browser, you'll see that this settings live has just two inputs, but they're editable inline. One's a name, one's an email. You can click on them, edit them. If you press enter, it saves them. If you're editing and you click away, it cancels the editing. Let's go ahead and open up our settings live to see how we implement that. As you can see, most of the rendering logic is happening in the live component itself. We have an editable input component. We pass in the field name, right? Field name or field email, and then we pass in the user struct. As you can see, the user struct, which is the assign, is coming from our mount. We grab that from the user ID, and we assign it as the user. And then we have a handle info, which we'll use to communicate with the live component, but it's really just giving us a new updated user. So as you can guess, we'll update the user in the live component, we'll send it here, and we'll reassign it as the user. And we do this because the user is controlled by the parent LiveView, the settings live. So since we're assigning it here, we want to make sure that we update it in the assigns in the parent LiveView. The other two are just a couple of helper functions. Let's go ahead and dive into the editable input component to see what it does. Now, as you might imagine, this is where all the magic happens. If you look at your render, we have an if-else statement. Let's take a look at the else first, because the if is when we're editing. So in the else case is when we first load the page, this is what we see. We are grabbing the field from the user struct. So for example, name, we would grab the name of the user, and we're just rendering that. But we have a Phoenix click edit, and we have a Phoenix target myself, meaning when we click on that div, we're gonna handle the edit event in the live component itself. And finally, we have this ID of the field. So if it's name, the ID is going to be name. And we're doing that because it's going to be helpful to target in our tests. So let's go ahead and take a look at the handle event really quick, at the edit handle event. All it's doing is assigning this edit to true. If you look at our mount, we start with false. So we're just setting the editable to true. If you go up here, that's our if statement. So let's now look at the if statement. In the if statement, when we're editing, we have a simple form. And as you might guess, we're passing the field itself in the form. So that's the input right here. So we have the field, this would be name or email, and we're passing the value here as well so that the input displays that value. Now, there's a few other things we want to look at here. We have the ID, and this is going to be helpful for testing. We're passing the field dash form. So when we want to target the form for the name, for example, we're going to name dash form. And we have a form assign, which we'll see in our mount. And here we have the Phoenix submit save, Phoenix click away cancel. So those are two events that the live component itself will get because we're using Phoenix target myself. Let's go ahead and take a look at those events. When we handle the cancel event, we're really just setting the edit back to false. And the most important part is when we save. We get these params, and these params come in a map. So that is, for example, the name and the new name, or the email and the new email. It's a very simple map. So what are we doing here? We grab the user in the assigns, we update it, and you can see that right down here. We are doing a very standard thing. We just grab the chain set with the params and we update that user. And rather than assign the user in the live components assigns, we are sending the parent LiveView a message saying that we've updated the user. And like we said that before, since the parent LiveView controls the user state, we want to update that there. And finally, we set edit back to false, and we do a no reply. So that's the core of it. Now, how do we test live components? Well, there are two things we can test about live components: the static content that we render and interactivity with them. Unfortunately, each of those approaches requires a very different way of testing, and we're going to see each of them in turn. Let's go ahead and test the static content first. So open up the test for this component itself. So that's going to be under test, Ranger Web Live, settings live, editable input component test. Now let's talk about the setup because we haven't done this before, but it should look very familiar. We're using the concase here, just like we do in LiveViewTest, and we're importing the Phoenix LiveViewTest helpers that come from here. Now, we don't technically need the concase for all of our component tests, but for some of them we might need it, and so it's helpful to just use it like this. And finally, we're going to alias the component itself. All right, let's go ahead and test that we can render that text. So that's really the core thing we can test statically. When our component first renders, it should show us the field, right? So if it's the name, it should be the user's name. And call renders field text. We'll define a fake user here. We don't actually need to create a full user. Go ahead and call it Frodo, and then we're gonna go ahead and use this render component function. If you remember, when we were testing function components, I said that this render component function could test both function components and live components. And so that's what we're doing here. We're going to pass in the editable input component here, and then we need to pass in the assign. So it had an ID of name, the field itself was name, and we're going to pass in the user. Excellent. Now, this is just static HTML. So we're plagued with all the same issues we've had in other tests when we're trying to just render an HTML blob. All we can assert is that some string is present in there. In this case, we can assert that the string Frodo is there, and that's a pretty decent test because we're making sure that the name of the user is rendered. So let's go ahead and run that test. Perfect, it passes. And if you want to make sure this is actually testing something valuable, we could go in here and go ahead and delete this rendering of that name. And let's see if this continues to pass. No, it fails. Just as we might expect, and just as we hope, because that means our test is testing something useful. All right, I'll put it back, run the test again. And I'll go back to the test. So this is how we can test static content. But what about interactivity with the live component? If we want to test interactivity with a live component, we have to do it via a regular LiveView. And so the test is going to be a regular LiveViewTest. That means we're going to have to mount the settings live, find an editable input component, be that the name or the email, and test the component that way. But at that point, it begs the question, are we testing the LiveView or are we testing the live component? And I think the answer is both. We're testing both because they're tied together. So if you look at the editable input component, this piece of code right here is really tying the LiveView to the live component. The live component can't live on its own, and in fact, it doesn't even own all its state. The user doesn't belong to the live component. It belongs in the parent LiveView. And for that reason, we're having process communicating with itself through message passing. We could also do this with Phoenix PubSub, but we're doing it message passing here. And so the live component itself is not completely decoupled from the LiveView. For that reason, I'm going to opt for writing the tests on setting live test, as opposed to writing them on this editable input component test that we were just writing in. But if you prefer, you could write them there. You still have to write the exact same test. All right, I'm going to go ahead and open up settings live and then go to the test. Now, since we're going to be testing this in the settings live, I want to test this from the user's perspective. That means we don't actually care that the editable input component is being used. We could, from the user's perspective, use something else or inline it. It doesn't matter. So long as the page behaves in the same way, the user doesn't care that we're using that component. So we're going to write our test from that perspective. In that case, I'm going to go ahead and write a first test asserting that we just rendered that initial static content. Basically what we tested with the live component, but we're going to test it here. So I'm going to go ahead and say renders users information. We'll take in the connection struct as usual. And now we're going to grab a user. I'm going to extract a helper function right here in a second. Let's grab the OK. We're going to ignore the view and grab the HTML. Once again, this is just the initial render. So let's go ahead and mount our LiveView in users. And we're going to pass in the user here and settings. And we're going to assert that in that HTML, we can find the user name and the user email. All right, let's go ahead and create this helper function. What is this doing? Let's go ahead and define some basic data. So this is going to be name, some name, email, random@example.com. We're going to go ahead and use a user chain set and repo insert it. Of course, you could have a context function for these things, but for our purposes, we're just doing it all in line here. And I have a typo here. There we go. Now I'm going to go ahead and alias the repo and the user. Perfect. Let's go ahead and run this test. Perfect, it passes. Once again, we can go ahead and test that this is actually testing something valid if we go ahead and go to our editable input component and remove that piece of code. Should run the test and it should fail. Excellent, the name is not there. I'll put this back, go back, and I'll go back to my test. Awesome. But now let's go ahead and test interactivity, which is what this is all about, right? So I'm going to go ahead and set test users can edit their name. Now, as you can see, I'm not actually saying that we're testing anything specific about the live component. I'm just going to say that a user can edit their name. Once again, they don't care how we implement this. So I'll go ahead and create a user here. And in this case, I'm going to define the name. Let's call him Frodo. And let's go ahead and mount the LiveView. I'm just going to go ahead and copy this. But in this case, we're going to use the view, ignore the HTML. I'll grab the view. We're going to target the name, that div, and we're going to click on it so that it changes from the non-editable to the editable state. So let's go ahead and call render click here. And then we're going to grab the view and then target that form. And if you remember, this had the format name form. That's the ID. And pardon me, this should be a form. And we're going to pass in the form data. And this is simple. We're updating the name here. So let's go ahead and say Bilbo. So we had a typo there or something where we said Frodo and we meant Bilbo. And then we're going to render submit. Once we do that, we can assert that the div with the name ID has the correct name on it, and it should be Bilbo. And I like doing this way. So I like specifying the name here so we know that it's Frodo, and then we're changing it to Bilbo, and rather than relying on the default name here. So I'm going to go ahead and take some attributes here, and it needs to be optional, and we're going to map merge those attributes. So I like how this test reads. We have a user with the name Frodo. We click on the name. We change that name to Bilbo, and we should see that as the new name. Let's go ahead and run this test. Perfect, it passes. Once again, you can test that this is actually doing some good stuff by go ahead. For example, let's delete that live component. We run it, it should fail. You can also test things within the editable input component itself. For example, we haven't tested that the editing functionality is there, so we could go ahead and delete the input, for example, run that test, and we should see it fail. Sure enough, it fails. So it's helpful to just run the test, make sure we're actually testing things. Or if you write your test first, like I usually do, then you would see this as you're writing the test. Excellent. So let's go back to our settings live test and analyze this test. As you can see, we're not explicitly testing the live component. We are testing this from the perspective of the user. And so we are testing the behavior, not the implementation. And that's a really important concept I wanted to take away. It's always important to test the behavior, not the implementation, because we could keep this test and change the implementation of the live component. And as long as this passes, the behavior that we care about, what our user sees, is the same. And so this gives us a lot of confidence. Now, because we're testing the settings live and the behavior from the user's perspective, I would go ahead and write another test for the email. This might seem redundant to you if we're trying to test the live component, but once again, since we've moved sort of away from testing the live component directly into testing the settings live itself, then we want to make sure that we're testing the behavior the user expects. And so instead of name here, we could go ahead and replace email, right? Email, and this can be Frodo@example. Where else do we have name? This should be email. Email, and this, let's say, it changes to Frodo@fellowship. So once he joins the fellowship, and then once, what else? Name should be email, and then this should be the same email here. Perfect. Let's run the test, and it passes. So this might seem overkill to you, given that we were first trying to test the live component. But since we have to test the live component through the LiveView, this is the exact same test we would have to write if we were writing it for the live component itself. Now, if the live component owned its full state, meaning the parent LiveView, for example, passed the ID of the user and the live component fetched the user and updated the user in there, I could see us moving this test into the live component. At that point, we don't have to test both the name and the email in the live component. We could just test the live component itself and treat the name as a sample usage of the live component. But I like to leave these in this case in the settings live test because, once again, they are interconnected. There's that connection. But just to prove the point, I'm going to go ahead and move this test to the live component just so you can see that we can test it that way. I'll actually move the bottom one and copy the create user function. So I'll go ahead and open up the editable input component here, and we'll have to alias repo and user. And I can run this test and it should pass the exact same way. So this test could live here, but once again, it depends a little bit on how independent the live component is. There's always a little bit of trade-off there, and you might choose a different path. All right, I hope you liked it. I'll see you in the next lesson.